our rabbit trail started opening up a can of worms, and now I got to do something with them. And so last week we were looking at how we respond to trials and how we respond to injustice that we see happening in the world. And we looked at the two, I would call, the most extreme views of the pendulum swing last week. The first being conquest, that we need to go out and we need to conquer, or we need to crusade. The Lord has given us power, and we need to use that power to go out and conquer in the name of Jesus. And so from that came things like the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, anything that opposed the perceived will of God needs to be conquered at all costs. The other end of that was the more pacific view, where peace is always pursued. You never strike back with violence. You always turn the other cheek. And if injustice is done to you, it's not passive in that there's no reaction, but your reaction is a non-violent response. And so you may do sit-ins, you may write petitions. The Apostle Paul appealed to see Caesar. And yet you always pursue a non-violent reaction to violence, because vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, do not ever repay evil for evil. And so the pursuit of peace, or the pacific view, would mean that we don't respond to injustice with any type of force. We battle it through peaceful means, and we try to find solutions in those kinds of ways. And so we looked at the history of that being with the Quakers and the Mennonites and the Amish and other groups that have held that view for many centuries. Now, where we're at coming now towards the middle is the balanced view that the Catholic Church eventually came to both of these positions. The second one's going to be more in recent history. And then the Reformation brought about what most people would embrace, called the just war theory. So tonight I want to look at this concept of just war theory. So if we're going to look at this as the crusade view, we're going to conquer, we're going to conquest. God gave us the sword, let's use the sword to make people believe in Him or obey Him. We're going to take a step a little bit over this way and say, if we're going to respond with violence, there better be a just reason. And hence the just war theory. The just war theory developed over several hundred years. It didn't just like one day, it wasn't like it just popped out and we're going to implement this new theory. It really came from Catholic theologians who were sitting over here watching what the church was doing in the Crusades, watching what happened during the Spanish Inquisition, watching this idea now that the church and the state have total authority to make nations be subdued before them, and saying, wait a minute, let's just step back from that a little bit and ask some questions. There was a bishop named Bishop Ambrose of Milan. He was around the time of Constantine, right when the Roman Empire started to be under Christian influence. And as the bishop saw some of these things starting to unfold in those early days of the Roman Church and the Roman government blending, he began to consider and challenge the Christian worldview to consider our obligation to defend the oppressed and the weak. And looking at some people who were being taken advantage of, even by the Catholic Church itself, he said, wait a minute, do we have an obligation not to go out and conquer everything, but maybe to just care for those who are vulnerable, those who are being taken advantage of, heavily based on Scripture, speaking of orphans and widows in the Old and the New Testament. And so that there's this vulnerable population that has been under injustice. Maybe somebody needs to stand up and defend them. Maybe somebody needs to defend the little guy. And he began to question then, how do we react with justice? How do we react with intervention of the sword and wars and all of these things? And he came up with a famous statement, and you may have heard this in different conversations, but he said, as we react to injustice, it should be the goal of the church to do no harm. And that phrase, do no harm, kind of clung to theology and kind of clung to response to injustice. So if somebody attacks, how do we defend ourselves? How do we defend the innocent without making it worse, without creating more death, more devastation? How do we intervene in a situation without doing more harm and just adding evil upon evil? And really that was his question. How do we react without adding evil on evil? To try to intervene without doing no harm. Now, he never actually came up with a theory of how that would work. He was more just questioning and postulating, thinking through some of these things. And it wouldn't be until the 5th century, several hundred years later, that Augustine of Hippo, who's famous for the city of God and his influence in some of the conquering kind of mentality that came out, he would begin to question that wars need to only be fought when necessary. And what does that look like? What does necessary mean? Now, we learned that the Roman Catholic Church would apply that where everything was necessary and they just needed to go out and conquer the world. But his question really was, if war is necessary, it should exist to confront grave wrongs. And that was his statement. We need to make sure that if we're going to battle, if we're using the sword, if we're going to seek to right wrongs, these need to be grave wrongs. You don't go kill your neighbor because his son threw a baseball through your window. You know, that's too extreme. It needs to be a grave wrong. It needs to be something that really is an evil on the earth, and we need to make sure that our cause is right if we're going to go to an extreme of war or killing. Later, it would actually be Thomas Aquinas now, 1260s, 1270s. We're coming out of the era of the Crusades. We're coming into the beginnings of the Age of Enlightenment. And Thomas Aquinas is going to say, wait a minute, this whole crusade theory, this whole Inquisition theory, this is clearly not what the Scripture is speaking of. This isn't what Christ intended for his church. And so he really, in his book, Summa Theologica, which is a summary of theology, he addressed this very clearly, and he postulated that war could only be waged by a properly instituted authority, such as the state, that it could not occur for purposes of self-gain, and that attaining peace must be its central aim. And so he added 3 things to what he felt theologically should be as a part of war. Hence, this is really the birth of just war. It kind of grew and developed, but under Thomas Aquinas theology, the Catholic Church embraced it, and it really caught on. And they applied this as war needs to be authorized by an appropriate authority, normally the state or the government. It needs to be for the right reason, and it needs to not be for self-interest. You don't just go conquer a nation because you want their water supply. You don't just go destroy a whole village because they have some gold in there that you want. And so the right reason needs to be there. And that became the normal doctrine of the Catholic Church. By the 1500s, they had fully embraced it and adopted it. In fact, the Catholic Church formulated a whole theory of war, which formed the foundation of our just war theory today, which was in effect in the Catholic Church clear through 1992. The Catholic Church's just war doctrine has been modified when things like nuclear bombs and different things have come out, how they view the just war theory and the use of those things, but its basic principles have remained. The 1992 Catechism of the Catholic Church says, in order for the Church to sanction engaging in a war, the damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, so they're pulling back theology from Augustine, and certain. All other means of putting an end to the conflict must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. There must be serious prospects of success, and the use of arms must not procure evils and disorders graver than the evil that they're trying to eliminate. Now, that's a lot of big words, but basically that boiled it down to 8 principles. And as the Reformation began and the Reformation churches began to pull out, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli, all of these groups began to pull out and leave the Catholic Church, Henry VIII and the Anglican Church, all of these things begin to happen. They took with them the just war theory. And that became the foundation for most views of Christianity's view of war. How do we handle these things? And so I want to go over with you the 8 criteria that they determined for judging war. And these have really held through the centuries. When we read things like the Declaration of Independence, you will hear all 8 of these points in the Declaration of Independence. Our founding fathers of our nation held this view very deeply. And so when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, they weren't just making stuff up. They were following the doctrine of just war theory, and it's actually ordered based on the outline of just war theory, and they include all of the 8 points. The Geneva Convention. By the way, what year was the Declaration of Independence? Close. 6, it was ratified. Yeah, they worked on it as early as 74, signed it in 76. Okay, so 76, it was finished, it's out, it's on the table. The Geneva Convention. How many of you know what the Geneva Convention is? Okay? The Geneva Convention was a council of the world leaders coming together and basically deciding, how are we going to fight fair? What does fair fighting look like? And they came up with a whole list of rules and guidelines of how wars should and should not be fought to be fought fair. And that came out basically following the outline, word for word, or point by point, of the just war theory. So as the Geneva Convention, which, by the way, is a long document, I set out to read it, and it's just too long. I didn't get through it. I just started jumping through the articles and reading the highlights, but I found that it really does just follow the outline of just war theory. By the way, when was the Geneva Convention finished and signed? After World War II, 1949. Yep. They began it before. They ratified it, and the final copy that we're working under today was signed in 1949. The New Deal. Yep, they had like this New Deal world thing that they were working on. Yep. But the Geneva Convention that we operate under today, 1949. So this theory has carried centuries. Centuries it's carried kind of the Christian view of war. And so let's just break down the points, and I want to show you some of the scriptures through history that led to this view. 1, war always, or when I say war, this is any sort of a violent reaction. So these even apply to the principles that we have for rights as a citizen. You know, if somebody's going to break into your house, what can you or can't you do under the laws of our country? These all fall under the just war theory. So these are going to sound very familiar to you because they form the foundation of our country's view of war, most of Europe's view of war. And if you ever wonder why other nations seem to not fight fair, it's because they never adopted these. They just kind of got told, this is what we see as fair and you're going to play by our rules. And that didn't really go over well for other countries that didn't have that view. So, and so that's why many don't respect the Geneva Convention, because they never adopted a just war theory. But first point, war or a response that takes force always demands a response to a real injury. There has to be real injury that's occurred before you can go to war against somebody. And that really falls under what we call a just cause. Is the cause to react a just cause? Did they actually do something to us? Was there actual real injury that happened before we go to war or before we fight back? And so is there a just cause? Really, the foundation for this, and I'm going to just trust you. If you're taking notes, you can write these down. If you want my notes, I'll give you a copy of them. I actually printed notes this time, so they're readable. Exodus 21. And in the law of Moses in Exodus 21, this is where we get things like, if a woman is pregnant and somebody injures her, and the baby is born okay, well, then he'll just basically pay the punishment for injuring somebody. But if the baby should die or be deformed, then it'll be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever damage that person did, that's what they will receive. And so if there's real injury, there's a real response to that injury. Things like if your ox goes and gores somebody, then the ox will be put to death, and the owner will simply be required to pay restitution to the family for the loss of life. But if the ox had prior violent acts, and the owner knew the ox to be violent, and it kills somebody under the knowledge that it was a dangerous animal, then the owner himself will suffer the sentence of murder, not taking care of the animal, knowing its violence tendency. And so there's real damage done. There's real harm that's happened, and that merits a real response. And so this principle from Exodus 21 was really the foundation for this idea of just war. If I was really harmed in some way, I have a just cause to go out and retaliate and seek that they pay for what they did, or they suffer what they made me suffer. And so that's the idea behind the just war, or the just cause, is that there's a response to a real injury. Second, that this war or this action has been declared by a legitimate authority, namely the state. Now, last week we looked at Romans 13 as a justification for the conquest. And what Thomas Aquinas really was the first one to question, are we looking at Romans 13 properly? Is it really that we have the sword to go out and conquer and to do whatever we want? Or is the government, we can go there. Let's look at Romans 13. It's important sometimes to just look at what the text says. Romans 13, if somebody would just read verse 1 through 3 for me, please. Romans 13, verse 1 through 3. So in those first three verses, that word comes up again and again and again, authority. Who has God given the authority to use that sword, to punish evil? And the Roman Catholic and Reformation view of that was, it's the human governments that God has established. God has put governments in place to secure justice, to secure order, to secure peace. And so it's those who are put in positions by God, that have the authority to make war, declare war, to go to war. It's not just every Joe Schmo who's got a chip on his shoulder. God has designated these people who have this power, who have this right to make war. And so the second question after first question, should we go to war? Has there been real injury? Second, do we have a legitimate authority that's challenging us or calling us to respond? And if there's not a legitimate authority in place, then we do not have a cause for war, and we need to back off. And so, for example, when we read the Declaration of Independence, they first state their cause. This is the reason we feel we need to declare independence, knowing they're going to war against Britain. Second, then, do we have the authority to do that? And hence we have the we the people, and their authority was based on we are calling independence based on the words they're using, God-given rights. And so we have authority to go against the authority that is over us. And they made their argument of why they felt that was appropriate. But without the declaration from a legitimate authority, then there is not a legitimate war. You don't have a cause, therefore you shouldn't go to war. Third, then, this authority that is legitimate, do they have the right intention? What is their motive? Because just because you're king doesn't mean on any whim you can send all your soldiers off to battle. What is your motive? What is it that you want to accomplish? Because if you're just sending us off to war, I'm just going to hit a nerve. If you're just sending us off to war to get oil, your motive is wrong. And as we saw what unfolded in the years following 9/11 and the response to terrorism by our president, by our nation, those who were protesting it, saying this war is not justified, they were picketing, and their cause was blood for oil, blood for oil. And what they were questioning wasn't, did the government have an authority to send soldiers? They were questioning the motive of the government. Why are you sending our soldiers to Iraq? Why are you sending our soldiers to Afghanistan? What's your motive? And they were questioning motive, and their appeal, whether they knew it or not, was that there was a violation of just war theory. On point 3, your motive is not right. It's not an honorable motive. And that was their challenge. That comes from Romans 13, if we continue on where we just were. If somebody will read verse 4 down through verse 7. Romans 13, 4 through 7. Thank you. So, as we see there, now in this second part of this Romans passage, we see repeated, these are God's ministers to execute his purpose. And what is that purpose? To honor those who do good and to punish those who are doing evil. And so if the motive isn't to elevate good and to punish evil, then it's the wrong motive. And so if, hypothetically, we are just going to war to secure oil as a resource, that's not good, and that's not punishing evil. That's just exploiting and taking something that we want for ourselves. And so the cause isn't just enough that some wrong was done. The motive now in retaliation, or the motive in going to war, has to be evaluated, and it has to be shown to be pure. And if that motive is not clearly communicated, then the war is not just. And hence, you get people protesting war, not based on authority, not based on a wrong was done, but what is the motive for going to war? Is this motive pure? Is it good? Is it just simply to promote good and to punish evil? Or is there an ulterior motive? Is there something corporate going on? Is there something political going on? Is there something to seek personal gain and personal advantage going on? And if that's the case, then the motive is wrong and the war is wrong. Fourth, is the goal to restore peace and justice? What is the goal of this war? What are we hoping to accomplish in retaliating? Or what are we hoping to accomplish in going to war? We've been wronged. We have an authority calling us to war. The motive is right. But as we're going to war, what is exactly the goal? Is the goal to secure peace? And if it's not that, under just war theory, if the final goal of this war is not to secure peace, then this war is not just. This is where what's going on today between Israel and Hamas is being really questioned by those in the just war position. This is why our Secretary of State has been over there now saying, you're going too far, this war is crossing too many lines, there's too many people dying. We'll look at some of these things in a moment. But the United Nations as a whole, including most of the European nations, are now counseling Israel, you're stepping out of bounds with this war against Hamas, because you're not going in any longer to secure peace. You're going in to annihilate the Hamas as an entire organization, and you're willing to do that at any cost. And so they're calling uncle, but you're still going. And you've got peace now. Nobody's shooting bombs at you anymore from Hamas, but you're continuing this war. And so this is where the just war theory people are saying, time out. We're now questioning your war. Is this a just war? Are you going too far? Have you taken this to an extreme? And this comes from, for example, Romans 12. If we back up a little bit from Romans 13, Romans 12, 17 to 21. Romans 12, 17 to 21. If somebody wants to read those few verses. Yeah, so we looked at this passage last week when we were over here on the organizations or the church history that would lean towards a peaceful response. And don't repay evil for evil. We'll overcome evil with good. Don't respond. Don't react. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. What the just war theory did, and this really developed more during the Reformation, it was the Reformed Church that really reinterpreted this a little bit from what the peace people were saying. And they said, look, this doesn't mean you just sit there and just take punch after punch after punch and do nothing about it. What it means is repay no one for evil for evil. We're talking now about motive, so we're coming back to that motive thing. We're not just retaliating because we want to do mean to the people that did mean to us. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. Verse 18, if it is possible, as much depends on you, live peaceably with all men. So they're saying, look, there's a clause there, if it is possible. But sometimes it's not. And so when we have to go to war, when we have to strike back, when we have to go to blows with somebody in our community, whatever the cause, whatever the reason, whatever injustice we need to respond to in some way, it's going to happen, and sometimes it's not going to be possible, and we're going to have to go to blows with them. But as much as it depends on us, keep peace. And so our mission, if we go to war, should always be to establish peace. That's the goal. So just do what you have to do to establish peace. Hence, we have peacekeeping missions that we run all over the world. And the foundation of peacekeeping missions as a military, as the United Nations, as all these organizations that go out and make war that we call peacekeeping missions. And I always kind of wondered that a little bit. We're going to go to war and call that peacekeeping. Something seems a little weird there. But it's based on this just war theory. If it's possible, which sometimes it's not, keep peace with all people. So when it's not, go to war, make your war, get to a place of peace, and that's it. That's the goal, that you establish peace. And so this interpretation of Romans 12 carried the Reformation Church through many wars, and it's carried Europe through many wars, and it's come over into our culture, and it really drives our war policies as a nation today, that we run these peacekeeping operations. And the goal is to go and do just enough battle to calm everything down and establish peace through war. And that's really how they got there, is through this just war theory. So the goal of every war, the goal of every intervention, the goal of every reaction is to make peace and stop there. Get to peace and stop. It's not conquest. Remember the Crusades over here, it was win at all costs. And the only result is they will subject to the Christianity that we're offering, or we chop their heads off. That's the two choices. We will conquer. We will win at all costs. Over here, they're saying just get to where you have peace, and that's the limit. That's the goal. That's where war stops. Number 5. Other reasonable means for peace have been made. Before you go to war, before you respond with action of any kind, have you tried every reasonable means to establish peace without going to war? Again, all of these things show themselves in the Declaration of Independence, and they mention this. We have made multiple efforts to try and establish peace between us and the magistrate. In fact, they had sent delegations over to England to try to work these things out, to work through the issues long before it ever came to war. One of the famous delegates was who? Benjamin Franklin. That's right. Benjamin Franklin made trips to try to figure out some compromise, some solution before the Declaration of Independence was signed and the war began. And so these things were all part of the just war theory. And war then, or attacking or responding with any form of force or violence, is always a last resort. And you'll hear those terms even today. We're going to war as last resort. And that terminology carries. In fact, the last several declarations of war that have been signed by our nation to go to war, those words last resort have come up in each of those declarations of war. It's a normal part of a declaration of war. This is being done as last resort. This goes back, by the way, to Deuteronomy chapter 20. You can just note that. We're not going to look at it tonight, but in Deuteronomy chapter 20, before you go and engage an enemy, the Lord said, go to them, try to make peace with them, and if they accept your peace offer, then live with them and dwell with them in peace. But if they refuse, then you go to war, then you go in and you conquer, then you annihilate, take every man, woman, and child, and you defeat them. And so this idea of Deuteronomy is you're going to give people a chance to find a peaceful solution before you go in and destroy their whole city. And this idea of a last resort becomes a foundational element of the just war theory. So that was point 5. Point 6, the damage of war will not exceed the original injury suffered. And so if somebody, for example, shoots a rocket over the border and takes out a school, we don't send nukes and wipe out 5 of their major cities. Okay? There's a rule of proportionality. Does the force used equal the force then that we're going to use to treat the issue? You don't bring, for example, a hand grenade to a BB gun fight. That's kind of the way this plays out in just war theory. Just because we have bigger weapons, just because we have stronger means, we don't use those means just because somebody did some sort of damage to us. The damage that we deal needs to be proportional to the damage that we received. This carries over, by the way, into our modern war practices. Some of us that have served in the military know that if we have an M16 in our hand, we don't get to just mow down a bunch of people that are coming at us with sticks. That would be highly frowned upon, and we would end up court-martialed and in prison for doing something like that. And so we have to react proportionally. The amount of force that we're threatened with is the amount of force that we're allowed to respond with. And that comes from the just war theory. And so we don't bring a nuclear bomb to a battlefront shootout between soldiers. We just don't do that. By the way, one of the things that was questioned during World War II was the use of nuclear force. And Truman was highly criticized, and in fact, it's been argued that he didn't continue his political career because many accused him of stepping out of the line of just war theory in using the nuclear bomb to try to bring an end to the war, because Japan had never done anything like that to any of its enemies. They had done atrocities, they'd done horrible things, but they never used anything like a nuclear bomb. And so Truman authorizing that and allowing that use of an escalated force, many people criticized him for breaking the rule of proportionality in war. And by a later admission that he said led to him wanting to withdraw from politics, just because everything he did, he was criticized. You just go too far. You're just a guy that goes too far. And so that idea of proportionality comes from the just war theory. You respond with the same kind of threat that you received. We kind of have that too, even just as kind of an honor code. I remember in high school, some guys, maybe getting in a fight. Well, he punched me. Well, I'm going to go to my car and I'm going to get my brass knuckles, and everyone, that's not fair. He punched you with an open fist, you go fight him with an open fist. And that was just understood. That was the way it was. You don't take a gun to a knife fight. That's not fair play. And this idea comes from proportionality. It's been with us since the just war theory, from the days of Thomas Aquinas. Number 7, there has to be a reasonable hope of achieving the goal, and the goal being peace. There has to be reasonable hope that this war that we're going to engage in, or this response that we're going to take, there's at least reasonable evidence or reasonable hope that we can actually achieve that. We're not going to just march our soldiers into a bloodbath when we know we've got no chance of winning. By the way, this comes from Luke 14:31, when Jesus said, "Who goes to war without first analyzing if they can win? And if they can't win, what are they called to do? Go make peace. Go make peace with them." If there's not a reasonable chance of winning, don't lead your troops to battle. We're not just out there to slaughter people to make a point. If we can't achieve peace through the battle, if we can't achieve peace through our response, then we are out of line to step across that boundary and go for it. If you can't win, don't go to war. If there's at least not a reasonable chance of winning, don't go to war. We don't fight losing battles. We don't fight losing battles. And so this is one of the things that's come out of the just war theory. To us, all of this sounds like common sense. How many of you are all just going, yeah, that totally makes sense to me? This is common sense because this is what we have grown up under for centuries. This has been the model that's dictated our response for a couple of thousand years. Number 8, and the last point of the just war theory, public explanation of reason for raging war. If the authority has deemed all of these things are in line, they have to give a public explanation for why they're doing what they do. Hence, the Declaration of Independence. Why did they bother writing the thing? Because just war theory demanded it. You have to publicly explain your motive, your reason, what was wronged, what you're hoping to right, why you want to establish this peace, and that your cause is just. And if you can't prove that, and that it's from a viable authority, and if those things aren't in place, then this war cannot be fought. And there needs to be a public explanation. Hence, we have public declaration of war. We cannot go to a war, although we can do peacekeeping operations, but we can't go to a war without a public declaration. Have you ever wondered why? Because just war theory. That's why. This has been the theory that's driven us for hundreds of years. And because of just war theory being ingrained into who we are and how we process war, process conflict, we just adopt this idea that if you're going to go to war, you need to make a public declaration. And this goes down to the playground. How many of you, Johnny says he's going to meet you after school and beat you up? Okay? You got to declare, this is what I'm going to do. This is why I'm going to do it. How many of us thought it was dirty when Johnny just jumped somebody out back of the gym and didn't tell anybody he was going to do it or why? That's dirty. That's just dirty fighting. That's dirty playground rules. Where did that come from? Why is that dirty? It was quite effective. It worked really well because it broke just war theory. And this is just kind of now programmed into how we view, how we react to things appropriately. You've got to tell why you're doing it and what you plan to do before you do it. And so we don't just go drop bombs on Japan. First we declare war. This is what we're going to do to you. And then we do it. Now it's okay. It's the just war theory. It's where it comes from. That's why we do things the way that we do. That's why the Geneva Convention decided you don't go make war with somebody unless you declare your reason. Which, by the way, it was this principle that got a guy named Dietrich Bonhoeffer in a lot of trouble. How many of you know who Dietrich Bonhoeffer is? Yeah. He was a pastor, theologian in the days of Nazi Germany. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer began to publicly state this point right here. All the rest, does Nazi Germany have the authority to declare war on France, to declare war on Poland, to do these things? Yeah, they have the authority. Have we legitimately been harmed? They felt they had after World War I. They thought they had a legitimate cause. He didn't question that. What is their goal? Well, the goal stated was we're just going to reestablish peace and get our economy going again. Okay, well, that seems like a noble goal. We just want peace. We just want to get restitution for how we were wronged after World War I. All of these things, all of these 7 points at the first part, Dietrich Bonhoeffer never challenged the Nazis on this or Adolf Hitler. But when it got to point 8, a public explanation for justifying and declaring this war, he challenged Adolf Hitler, he challenged the Nazis, and he said, you have never explained to us the people why we are fighting this war in France. You've never explained to us why we're invading Poland. We want to know. We have a right to know, and his right to know was based on just war theory. And you know what Adolf Hitler's reaction was? Shut that guy up and throw him in jail. and he ended up dying. Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And his biggest challenge to the Nazis was this point right here. You never gave us a public explanation why we're fighting this war. And that got him in a lot of trouble. And so, this idea that if there's a war being fought, that those authorities in place need to explain to the people that are affected by this war. It's our sons and daughters who are dying. It's our money that's funding this war. We're the ones that are, melting down our coffee pots to send in, to build artillery shells for this war. You better explain to us why we're fighting this war. And that became the 8th point of the just war theory. So that led to then measures of justifiable conduct. Out of that then, things like war doesn't target non-combatants. How many of you have heard the term non-combatant? Yeah, non-combatants are civilians. You don't bomb schools. You don't bomb hospitals. As we're looking at what's happening in Ukraine right now, and all of us are questioning, why on earth are these Ukrainian schools being bombed? Why are apartment buildings being bombed? These are not military people. These aren't people fighting a war. These are people just trying to survive. And we're cringing, saying that is not the way war is supposed to be fought. And you know what Putin's over there saying? He's like, I didn't grow up in Christian just war theory culture. I just want to win. All I got to do is defeat these people. All I got to do is terrify these people till they give me what I want. I don't care about these rules. Where did you guys come up with the rules? I never agreed to your rules. Because he didn't. The Eastern Orthodox Church, under which Russia grew up under, never adopted a just war theory. And in fact, the Crusades kind of flipped them away from it, and they broke ties with anything that the Catholic theologians were doing. As the Reformation happened, they thought the Reformation was just proof that the Catholic Church was messed up, and they're all messed up. And the Eastern Orthodox Church drifted. It's hard to explain. We'll get into that next week because I'm running out of time. But Putin is coming from a whole different worldview than a just war theory. And what he's doing under his theory makes perfect sense. And the rest of us are sitting back going, that guy doesn't play by the rules. He's dirty. He's corrupt. He's nasty. He's a bad guy, which is all true. But we just assume these things, that non-combatants are not to be targeted in war. And this idea then that we only use appropriate force for a situation. Hence, in our country, is it okay if a kid throws a baseball through your window to go take your 9mm and shoot up his car? Is that going to be acceptable under our law? No, that's not an appropriate response. He threw a baseball through your window. You might get away with throwing a baseball through his dad's window. That might cause a little ruffle, but at the end of the day, okay, that was stupid, but okay, everybody's fair, it's even, get over it. But if you go and shoot up his whole car, you're the one that's going to end up in jail, not the kid that threw a baseball through your window. And all of that, proportional response, all of that comes from just war theory. So, I'm going to stop there for tonight because I went a lot longer than I thought that was going to take. But I do want to just point out that this idea that most nations that have had a Christian influence, Europe, even down into Latin America, although Latin America is a weird thing. We'll look at some of how they got where they are today with the cartels and why they do what they do. Because the Catholic Church changed right as Latin America was embracing Catholicism. So they got two confused views, and they got a real messed up vision of war down in South America today. Hence why South America is such a mess. But this idea that most Christian nations determine, is a war appropriate or not? They use these criteria. When we read the Star-Spangled Banner, when was the Star-Spangled Banner written? 1812. War of 1812. Francis Scott Key, he's prisoned, he's out on a ship, he pens this hymn, this song that has become our national anthem. And in the second verse of that, which we don't sing very often, but in the second verse of that, the line comes out, and conquer we must if, there's an if in there, our cause is just. The just war theory drove the whole heart, even of the War of 1812. And this is so rooted into us. It's so rooted into the European nations. That's why the European nations and America, we just don't fight wars the way the rest of the world does. And we scratch our heads and we're baffled why these other countries just don't play nice. And have you ever wondered why the soldiers in the Revolution would just march up to a line and stand there and then just start shooting each other until one of them finally gave up and ran away? You think, why would they do that? That's a horrible strategy of war, because this is what they were taught. There's rules to war, and you fight according to the rules. And all of a sudden, the Americans started changing the rules, and the British didn't know what to do about it. And actually, the British accused the Americans of being heathens because they quit fighting by the rules. They were breaking outside of just war theory as it was understood in the day. And so it all ties into who we are and how we've gotten where we are, why we look at things the way we do. And so as we look at things like self-defense, there's so many rules about self-defense. You have to prove these things. If you're going to shoot somebody in your home, you have to prove that real harm was done, that you were threatened in some way. You can't just shoot somebody that walks in your door and then later figure out what they were doing there. That's gotten people in a lot of trouble recently. In fact, a kid knocked on the wrong door and got shot, and that guy that shot him is in prison for life because he didn't have just cause. And so these ideas of self-defense are rooted in our just war theory. All of this, all of how we have looked at war for many, many years is rooted in the just war theory. So we don't want to be these conquerors. We understand, most of us, this isn't the right path. Although we can get sucked into it. When I do my final wrap-up, I'll explain that. Most of us aren't like, just sit here and take it, just be a punching bag for the rest of the world to beat on you Christians while you do nothing. Most of us aren't there. I will just tell you personally, I'm going to lean more to this side as I've grown and I've studied God's Word. But I'm personally moving more away from the just war theory, not because I don't think it makes sense, because I think God's Word shows a better way. And that's what I'll explain next week. Next week, we'll get to this side of the story where we're under what is known today as the just peacemaking theory. The just peacemaking theory. And we'll talk about the nuances of that. It also has points to it. It's more recent, really unfolding in the 1950s. 1980s is really where it kind of took fruition. And my initial reaction to it was negative, and I'll explain to you why. Because it just doesn't feel right, because I've grown up so long with this. But we'll talk through some of that next week as we get into the just peacemaking theory. So, questions, comments, thoughts? Mm-hmm. Yes. That's correct. Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. They did not. There have been multiple times where, from just war theory, it slides very easily into the conquest. We need to win, and that's just whatever it takes. We need to win, whatever it takes. When you get over here, the rules are really off the table. It's all objective driven. We have to conquer. We have to win. Over here, our cause is just, and we do need to win if our cause is just. Victory we must if our cause is just, or conquer we must if our cause is just. But we're bound. We're bound morally by some lines that we just don't cross. And so if we cross those lines, we're accepting, now we're taking on this theory over here. And throughout history, that theory has been used many times. The question remains for the church, is it the church that we're going to embrace this and we're going to look at the world through this lens? Are we going to look at it through this lens? Are the Quakers right? Do we need to be over here? Is this the place where God wants us to be? And this is something the church has wrestled with, and it's not an easy question to answer. I wish it was just, here's how it always works, and it always just fits into this nice little box, but it doesn't. And I think there's a recognition that we can go too far, even as Christians, and we certainly don't want to just sit here and watch the world, orphans and widows be murdered and taken advantage of, and sit there and just go, man, that's too bad for them. Good thing vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. I'm just going to sit here and watch this man beat his wife right in front of me, and I'm just going to start praying for her. That doesn't feel right to us. And probably in 90% of situations, it's not right for us. And so how do we know? How do we know when to step in and when to step aside? And those are the questions that we continue to wrestle with. But next week we'll look at the just peacemaking theory. Gives us a few more tools to put in our bag, a little different way to look at the world, to look at war, to look at conflict, to look at intervention. And I will just tell you, we who have walked with the Lord, who have studied the Scriptures, most of the time we're probably going to be like here and over here. We're going to be bouncing between, there's a time when we do need to step in and intervene, and we need to take this just war mentality, but we're not going to just start killing women and children so we can win at all costs. And yet, there's times when we really could do a better job pursuing peace and making peace so we don't have to take these measures over here. And so we'll look at those next week. But I just want you to know these things are not settled, and these things are not easy, and there's no just clear checklist. The just war theory sounds nice. If you could just check the boxes, hey, everything's a go, God's on our side, let's do this. It hasn't always been that simple, and it's not always quite that clean. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But thank you, Kevin. You're right. When you got things like Charlemagne's situation or what Israel's dealing with Hamas, it's pretty hard to say, you guys just need to sit here in this box. It's easy to say, but we're not having to live their experience. Other comments, questions? All right. That should have mostly sounded familiar to you. There shouldn't have been anything in there that was like, oh, I'm going to have to wrestle with that a little bit, because that's what we have grown up with. That's the philosophy that's driven us for a long, long time. Okay, next week we'll get into